I'd like to welcome Mr. John Bolton, and I would like to thank him and all the American friends because of their effort. I think that U.S. and Taiwan's relationship can be improved so much, and I'm grateful. Thank you. 大家好早。今日真欢喜来参加这边的国事会议。国际上变化真紧。美国甲中国的关系按对抗，按合作变做对抗。因为 COVID-19 武汉肺炎的关系，世界的经济嘛在改变，所以按经济上国际分工嘛已经结束。Ukraine 甲 Russia 的这个战争，和台湾在国际上凸显，大家拢感觉讲，今日的 Ukraine 就是未来的大海，所以大家拢关心台湾海峡的这个安全的问题，所以即马慢慢形成国际上民主国家甲极权国家的一款对立。我咧想，咱台湾加在有过去咱科学上的一个努力，所以咱咱的半导体变做世界非常重要的一个产业，所以在世界上无法度通欠缺咱台湾对这部分的贡献。所以咱今日台湾的地位，在国际上慢慢有受到重视。所以咱今日甲台湾、甲美国、甲欧洲的关系嘛愈来愈好。但是问题是咱台湾的内部，台湾的内部因为国民党的教育洗脑，所以互咱台湾国家认同分裂，到目前也阁有咱的军官走去中国，咱的这个马英九走去中国，所以我看咱台湾的问题。其实上严重的，可能是咱内部的这个问题。所以咱今日咧举办这个国事会议，差不多逐摆拢是针对当前咱台湾的问题。所以咱今日特别咧强调。就是强调民主的韧性，甲捍卫本土政权。在未来，我相信咱民间应当是向政府 建议讲领导中国的人，互伊一点仔时间，互因去决定，看要转去中国无。我相信，咱有法度通派专机送伊转去中国，无需要互因阁继续用一寡奇奇怪怪的言论来扰乱咱台湾的社会。像讲避战会引起战争，其实咱台湾人无了解咱台湾的历史。咱互国民党咧统治的中间，伊是按咱的精英，所有的人拢甲拍死。所以对付中国，你绝对就爱强起来。你若对伊示弱，我相信因绝对会来拍台湾。但是咱今仔日若有准备，也有备战，中国人都唔敢拍台湾。所以未来的这年的选举，对台湾非常的重要。我是感觉讲，这边的选举会影响到未来的台湾的发展。所以我会感觉，咱台湾人一定要爱这边团结起来，战胜中国的势力。所以希望咱明年的选举，我都通继续执政，继续互中国人离开台湾。所以最后，希望大家身体健康，万事如意。多谢大家的参与，谢谢。
咱这段的时间排，敢若有较长淡薄。你安排甲讲吼，你看咱加讲几句啊，无来讲笑。所以确定啊，我要来宣插蔡英文总统甲赖清德副总统伊送来的书面的甲咱贺词。咱这无翻译，这有翻译无 ？I will read the written greetings from President Tsai and the Vice President Lai. There's no translation, so but use your imagination. Okay. 你看总统、副总统的贺词吼，可能看几十年啊，大家拢知影你讲啥，我来讲笑。好来，中华民国，无这莫讲。这总统来甲咱致辞吼，世界台湾人大会，就但我就确定这是总统，确定个。总统、副总统参对 ，OK， 好来，按头去定来。世界台湾人大会听温如召集人，台湾国家人民5事民总召集人，以及各位先进好朋友，大家好。过去3年多来，台湾面对疫情的冲击，国际政经情势变化等各项挑战。但咱追求进步发展的脚步，从来无停下来。 各位先进好朋友的努力，就是最好的证明。世界台湾大会甲台湾国家人民合办的海内外台湾国事会议，伫疫情挑战之下持续举行，今年已经迈入第12届。我要感谢主办单位用心，甲大家参与，斗阵来关心台湾的未来。这次大会主题是强化民主韧性，捍卫本土政权。这几年来，阮执政团队用心努力，甲民主国家增进合作交流，就是要让台湾的民主更加进步，实力更加强大，会当得到国民甲国际社会的认同甲肯定。亲像是台湾甲美国积极推动全球合作甲训练架构 GCTF 那敢若日本、澳洲陆续加入正做了正式的谈判。咱的合作对象也对印太地区扩大到欧洲、拉丁美洲，加入美海甲中东地区。伫这中间，咱甲各国讨论打击无实的信息，甲跨国的犯罪的策略，以应付境外对敌势力的自粉战、临时战的威胁，共同捍卫民主自由的价值。台湾对民主自由的坚持已经互世界看见，特别是顶年8月中国对台湾持续的军演以后，真侪外宾陆续访问台湾。这个访问团来自世界各地，拢是为了表达对台湾的支持。当世界行进台湾，台湾会也行向世界。近来我拄完成疫情后的第一次的出访，除了访问友邦瓜地那玛甲贝里斯，也过境美国。咱清楚地向全世界传达，台湾会坚定地捍卫自由民主价值，持续地做国际社会良相的力量。台湾正做全球经济的关键力量，会持续追求甲友盟国家的共赢发展。台湾走向世界的决心只会愈来愈坚定。这个台湾前进的方向，需要各位先进好朋友，大家斗阵来行。透过这摆的出访，我也再次感受到海外侨胞朋友对故乡的支持，已经为台湾辛苦军营的成果。我要再次感谢大家付出。咱对台湾的理解，对台湾的关心，无论海内外，我也相信，只要咱团结一致，台湾行向世界，迈向进步发展的脚步，不止袂停，也佫会更加稳健，大步进前。咱斗阵继续努力，多谢大家。总统蔡英文公元2023年4月29日，来咱来大家拍鼓啊！多谢。下面是副总统赖清德。世界台湾人大会 听召集人文如、台湾国家人民五总召人市民、各位关心台湾前途的父老兄弟，大家平安，大家好。非常荣幸受邀请参加第12届海内外台湾国事会议。本届国事会议以中华民主韧性、捍卫本土政权为主题，那非常切合当前国家发展的需要。相信经过来自全球各位先进集思广益后，必会有对帮助伫凝聚国人的向心力，并向世界展现台湾捍卫民主价值、维护印太地区和平稳定的决心。特别照着市民的号词，向各位先进致上最深的敬意甲感谢。台湾处理西太平洋第一岛链的关键位置，台湾的安全甲繁荣，事关全球民主价值的延续，后代子孙的幸福，以及印太地区的和平稳定。所以，台湾一定要发挥关键的力量，透过民主活力，深化民主同伴的关系。除了加强区域安全合作之外，也应该爱透过民主自由价值、公卫医疗经验、半导体产业链，也是宗教自由、体育交流、青年服务以及学术研究等等的成就，来斗阵理念相同的国家，成立民主和平共同体，维护台海、印太以及世界的和平。过去7年，伫蔡总统的领导以及各位前辈的拍拼下面，台湾已经行伫正确的道路。世界已经看起台湾，已经肯定台湾。我拜托各位前辈，一定要抱着疼惜台湾的初心，大家徛做伙，伫相同的民主道路上，继续支持本土执政团队稳健的改革路线，将挑战变做机会，持续壮大民主台湾，互世界看见台湾的价值。互台湾成做民主世界的 MVP， 大家斗阵加油！恭逢这个盛会，庆祝大会圆满顺利，诸君平安健康。副总统赖清德，公元2023年4月29日，请大家拍鼓啊！多谢。咱的时间已经来遮 ，OK。咱下面特别请咱的侨务委员会委员长徐家清要来给咱致辞，请咱大家来欢迎徐家清委员长。
世界台湾人大会，咱的召集人。陈韵如召集人，咱的国家联名总召集人吴树明医师，咱台湾公共事务会发拍的简明子会长，还有咱台湾同乡会联合会傅佩芬会长，our distinguished guests, former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, ladies and gentlemen, good morning， 大家好早。I'm honored to attend this conference organized by the Taiwan Nation Alliance and the World Taiwanese Congress. I'm grateful to the organizers and the participants for their support of Taiwan. Former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton is a special guest at this conference. I thank him for his support for Taiwan and welcome him insights on how to defend Taiwan democratic system. Thank you. 非常感谢咱今仔日的主办单位世界台湾人大会，还佫有咱台湾国家人民的努力，互咱海内外所有的乡亲时代，大家拢会当成功来举办咱第12届的国事会议。伫即届的会议，我相信有真大的特别意义，就是疫情了，咱会当搁一摆实体，大家共同斗阵，而且咱即一摆所安排的主题是非常有建设性。 有未来性的题目，所以嘉青伫遮除了表示非常感谢咱即届大会主办单位的用心之外，我嘛要代表侨务委员会，甲各位保证伫咧咱30多年来台湾的民主化过程当中，中华民国虽然咱即个名称毋是介介意，总是咱爱有一个 legalize 的过程。我相信有一天，咱一定会是。 用咱家己介意的名，伫咧全世界成做一个国家，所以即一点，侨务委员会嘛真认真来努力，徛伫咧台湾的主体性，激励咱所有伫海内外的乡亲时代，尤其咱真侪伫海外的各界侨民，大家拢真努力伫咧无共的国家伫咧拍拼，咱会当用各种无共款的方式，无一定是政治上的，咱阁有真侪文化上。 音乐上、科技、教育的各种交流，来展现咱台湾的实力。所以今仔日伫即个所在，我除了要感谢咱主办单位，对着即届12届所举办活动的用心，我嘛要甲大家搁一届来感谢大家对侨务委员会即几年的关心甲参与。未来的路上，拢需要大家共同继续来拍拼。我嘛真欢喜看到。 咱拢是老朋友，即届的召集人是陈韵如，我叫伊韵如姐，佫有咱发牌会长林子兄，佫有傅佩芬是我伫咧德国读书的同学，所以今仔日徛伫咧即所在，我是有一个足特别的心情，感受到咱大家共同徛伫咧即个所在，不但是为着台湾的未来努力，嘛是要向全世界来表示咱台湾要积极来参与，贡献咱的力量的一个开始。我相信，毋是世界的无共国家的朋友关心咱，咱嘛爱积极来关心世界各国的朋友，更加扩大咱甲无共国家、无共世界的文化的人结连的一个力量。我相信，以咱台湾善良的本性，咱一定会当结交搁较侪。 的朋友，嘛会当互台湾真正真深入行入去全世界国际社会。搁一摆伫遮祝福咱各位健康平安，嘛祝福今仔的大会非常的顺利。Thank you very much.
真多谢徐嘉欣委员长。 我以前伫担任海外的社团的负责人，就对无侨务委员会委员长来讲话。因为咱真古早就咧推行即个侨务委员会的制度。咱的侨务委员会应该并入去外交部就会使吼。不过徐嘉欣讲的，我捌你真久吼，看起来佫还好啦。喂，因为佫有时间了，加减伫遮安尼，多谢你，多谢你，今仔日特别专工来。咱时间有了事啦，不过我想吼，咱就较早来个开始，互咱即个远路来，佫伫算讲伫美国非常有重量的一个 演讲者，互伊较侪时间。我想无要紧啊，我头仔想讲时政新闻的讲较侪时间，伊佫叫嘛是简单扼要啦，多谢。张摩顿，我即摆无，因较顶仔介绍吼，主持人的介绍，咱抑佫加有一个伊真重要的一个算 title 啦，伊做过美国驻联合国的大使。这嘛是真重要。我用我一分钟了。咱以前世界台湾人大会捌一遍伫华盛顿 DC 要开会。伊迄阵伊是做 Assistant Secretary of State Department。甲迄个Randy Schreiber， 伊是 Deputy Assistant Secretary something like that。We WTC went to DC to hold a meeting. From what I heard, you sent us a message. You like to attend our meeting in Washington DC. 迄阵是完全无可能啊！伫美国的官正式的官要来参加即款台湾的即款独立团体的会哦，完全无可能。所以我做足欢喜的，但是你知影 DC 吼，媒体一大堆啦，毋知影消息去传出去，the message you come to our meeting lead to the media， 所以就敢若大家拢知影，所以结果伊无来啊，真可惜迄边无甲伊斗阵。不过今仔日会当搁当面，互伊来遮甲咱讲，我嘛感觉真欢喜吼。好，安尼咱要刷到下面，咱就来举行下面的节目。下面就是算咱的主题演讲keynote speaker， 迄个请听焦一林来主持这个节目，咱的多阿姨啊来小。要徛喺遮讲了。OK， 好，歹势。好，安尼请听总召集人来开始，多谢，大家拍拍者。
Ambassador Bolton， 徐家清委员，我无要一一唱名啦吼。搁一个我是要甲大家讲，咱今仔日有迄个路透社的社长，伫台湾驻的社长 ，Mr. Ben Blanchard，please stand up。And we have William Stanton right here. And the G-Man, this is the first time I ever met him. You're on speaker. Okay, and the 主席甲总召，可能我就无要搁一一唱名啊啦吼。欢迎大家来参加。我是爱直接爱介绍 Ambassador Bolton. Sorry, I'm not going to speak English, okay? Then I needed another translation. So we're going to skip that. Mr. Bolton， 伊去年咱有咧线顶，已经咱有听过伊一个足精彩的演讲会啊，迄阵咱嘛有甲介绍，所以我相信咧在座的大家应该是对不只啊熟悉啊啦吼。伊是咧1948年出生，伫 Baltimore Maryland 出生吼。我毋知影伊比我较少岁呢。1974年毕业，咧 Yale University 的法律 Law School 啦吼。我要提起的就是讲伊的足特别的吼，伊较特别的是伊的政治生涯吼，差不多40年啊。伊这40年中间，伊有服务过美国4任的总统过，这实在是足无简单的啦吼。伊第一个就是 Ronald Reagan 吼，第二个是George H.W. Bush， 就是迄个老布什啦吼。啊，第三个是 George W. Bush 的小布什总统。啊，第四个是Donald Trump。啊，伊咧即个40年的中间吼，较重要就是拄啊，迄个中国伊有讲过，就是伊咧2005年到06年的时阵，伊有做过驻联合国的大使过，就是安尼。即马才大家抑阁是咧叫伊 ambassador 就对啦吼。啊，佫一个是上尾伊一个伫咧 Trump 的任期中间吼，伊是有做过美国国家安全的顾问。啊，即马就摕落来，为政府就遐摕落来。伊即马伊家己有一个智库，伫 DC 的一个智库是国家安全甲自由的基金会，啊，伊是主席啊 ，chairman 吼。啊，伊是一个政党是共和党啦吼。啊，伊的主张吼是就是伊较主张美国的外交较强啦吼，爱较强的外交。啊，尤其是对中国的态度啦吼，伊讲对中国的态度爱有迄个强硬的态度啦吼，即个是咱较介意的。啊，抑佫一个上较重要就是，伊也主张讲，要美国爱承认咱台湾是一个国家。Let's give him a big hand. 伊伫咧迄个国家安全顾问做了的时阵了吼，伊有出版一本册，叫做《The Room Where It Happened》。啊，这种变做美国的一个足畅销的册啦吼。你若有机会，可能会当去买来看。我看下。啊，伊旧年吼，互咱一个足印象诚深的演讲啦吼。啊，咱。The last, I want to congratulate you, your daughter's engagement, and the upcoming wedding at June. Congratulations! 因早囝要结婚啊，所以伊嘛真欢喜，咱甲伊恭喜一下。So, let's welcome Ambassador Bolton, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in person this year as opposed to last year, and glad to be with all of you. I was watching CNN on television this morning before I came over here, and I saw a report that the Chinese government had sent around one of its most sophisticated drones to go all the way around the island, a Scorpion, which is capable of carrying pretty sophisticated weapons. And the reporters speculated that the flight of this drone might have had something to do with my being here. I would be honored if that's true. But I think it's really more simply a part of Beijing's overall effort to intimidate the people on this island. And it's been underway for some time. It's growing in strength. But it makes your gathering this weekend, I think, all the more important. Because if these acts by the Chinese government are intended to intimidate the people of Taiwan, I think they will find failure, because I think it will energize the people of Taiwan to support remaining being a free people in a free country. I hope that means the interpreters are keeping up, but I couldn't tell, so I hope that's right. I want to cover a number of points with you this morning, and then we'll have a panel that follows where perhaps other things can be asked in the questions. But to help your efforts on behalf of keeping Taiwan free, I do think it's important to understand that we are now entering a new era internationally. I think the post-Cold War era is over. Obviously, the Cold War ended in 1991, and I think too many people in the West in particular felt that, as they said, we had reached the end of history, that there were no more threats in the world, that the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that we could cut our defense budgets, which we did. And these same voices said that China would not pose a threat to the rest of the world. It was engaged in a peaceful rise, that it would be a responsible stakeholder in world affairs, and that China's development would parallel the development of other successful democratic, market-oriented economies in the developing world. Now, in fact, as to China, the exact opposite has happened. We have a country that, so far from becoming more democratic, has become steadily less democratic. Xi Jinping is now the most powerful ruler in China since Mao Zedong. And if you want to ask about the possibilities of dissent in China, ask Hu Jintao what it's like to be led off the stage of the Chinese Communist Party Congress, one of the most humiliating acts of a political leader I have ever seen. Internationally, China has not been a responsible stakeholder. It has pursued mercantilist policies in what should be a free trade organization, and it has used all of its elements of power to achieve hegemony in the space near China and ultimately worldwide. Even after the attacks on the United States on 9/11, too many people in the West in particular thought we were on a holiday from reality. Growing Chinese and Russian threats were ignored or explained away. Russia attacked Georgia in 2008. Nobody paid any attention. Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014. Almost nothing happened. China militarized the South China Sea, and there were almost no objections. It has made repeated provocations in the East China Sea, most recently directed at Taiwan, and now we'll see what the reaction of the West is. I think the visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow and his meetings with Vladimir Putin really highlight the fact that in the new era we're in, there's a new axis between Beijing and Moscow, different from the Sino-Soviet alliance of Cold War days, because China is the senior partner and Russia is the junior partner. But it's the axis together with its rogue state outriders like North Korea and Iran and Belarus that make the entire world a more dangerous place. So I think what we need to do in the United States is awaken from this end of history dream that we've been in. And not just in political military terms, but in economic and social terms as well. And what Taiwan needs to do is to think in the larger context of East and South Asia, where the Chinese threat applies to many nations, that the Chinese threat to South Korea, like North Korea's threat to South Korea, directly affects Taiwan as well. In other words, in the new era that we're entering, because of the combined threats we're facing, the threat to Taiwan is part of a larger range of threats. And I know that may sound like that doesn't give Taiwan the prominence it should have. My argument to you is that being seen as an element of a larger threat actually enhances Taiwan's security, because others need to think of Taiwan, not just here on Taiwan or in the United States, but in the wider world. Now, looking at how Taiwan fits into this larger world and how it affects the United States and how the United States sees China, I think it's important to define what the Chinese threat is. And for the United States, I think the threat in the 21st century is existential, as it is to Taiwan's independence and has been for some time. We don't need to guess about this threat. Beijing articulates it almost every day, aimed at Taiwan. Persistent, unceasing efforts to delegitimize Taiwan by extinguishing bilateral diplomatic relations. The repression Beijing has undertaken in Hong Kong, breaching the handover agreement made with Great Britain over 30 years ago, and establishing an ongoing, full-spectrum military buildup with a clear focus on establishing hegemony along the Indo-Pacific periphery, and as I say, ultimately worldwide. The Chinese threat is global. I think it's important to repeat that. For example, the utterly false idea that China could be a broker in the Ukraine war. The example of the Chinese foreign minister symbolizing a new deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Joint Chinese, Russian, Iranian naval maneuvers in the Arabian Sea, and the Belt and Road Initiative reaching into Latin America and Africa. And the Chinese threat is economic and social, as well as politico-military. The Chinese have spent 3 or 4 decades or more stealing intellectual property from the United States, Europe, the other developed countries of the world, which they then convert to their own advantage. They have used companies as arms of the Chinese state. Huawei and ZTE are not telecommunications companies. They represent part of China's effort to take control of 5th generation telecommunications, so that essentially everything that's said over their networks, said or transmitted as data, can be retrieved by China and used for China's advantage. So when you look at this overall threat that China poses, we can say that, I think with confidence, that Taiwan is what the Germans call the Schwerpunkt, what Clausewitz focused on in his studies of war. This is, on this island, the center of gravity of the Chinese threat. And understanding that helps Taiwan over the long term explain to others, also now feeling the Chinese threat, why there's a common bond and why efforts at collective protection and self-defense become so important. Now, there are certainly minuses as well as pluses to being the Schwerpunkt, because this is where a lot will be decided. And I understand that there's a lot of discussion here in Taiwan as you enter a presidential election campaign, as there is a lot of discussion in the United States about how Taiwan should not be provocative, that Taiwan should be very careful in everything that it says and does. Now, obviously, all government officials try to be prudent. That's important. But let's be clear when we talk about what's provocative. What's really provocative to China is that Taiwan exists at all as it does today. Every morning when Taiwan wakes up, Beijing is offended. And that's not going to change. So my advice, for what it's worth, is in the face of this massive Chinese threat, let's not become obsessed with symbols. Let's focus on concrete reality, not abstractions or gestures. Ultimately, maintaining independence rests on palpable structures of force economically, militarily, and politically. Much more important than the symbols. The symbols, I think, can come later. My former boss, Secretary of State James Baker, used to tell me all the time, he'd say, keep your eyes on the prize. Keep your eyes on the prize. And the prize is maintaining a free government here in Taiwan. It's a fact that particular verbal formulations are really not going to solve anything. They don't form a defense for Taiwan any more than words really form an offense for China. Take the so-called one China policy. China has so distorted what the Shanghai Communique said, has twisted what that was intended to mean so dramatically that many people in America say one China policy as if they were following Beijing's interpretation, when in fact they don't know the difference and the subtleties that were in that phrase to begin with. So it's not a question of finding the right phrase, it's a question of finding the right capabilities and allies for Taiwan to maintain its status. And in the United States today, I want to be clear with you, there is an example ongoing of a people who have been unjustifiably attacked by their neighbor and are fighting back, and that's Ukraine. Many people thought Ukraine wouldn't fight. They said, well, it's just part of Russia, really, historically. Whereas, in fact, the Ukrainians have fought with skill and morale and effectiveness. And the example they've set provides, I think, an example for Taiwan as well. So that when people say, well, will Taiwan fight for its independence? Or do they expect... That's the right answer. That's what China has to understand. That the people here believe in governing themselves, and they're not going to give it up. And it's important that that's communicated to the United States, so that when commentators say the Taiwanese are using American support, but they're really not prepared to defend themselves, that's wrong. That's wrong. And that if it came to military action, that Taiwan would fight. Showing that capability reduces the possibility of actual hostilities. By increasing not just military capability, but the spirit that Taiwan believes in its separateness, helps deter China from undertaking military action in the first place. That's why it's not provocative to build up Taiwan's capabilities. As the saying goes, strength is not provocative. Weakness is provocative. And that's what needs to be avoided in Taiwan. We know how important Taiwan is to the United States economically. It's the 8th largest trading partner of the United States, almost equal to the United Kingdom in terms of volume. We know about TSMC and computer chip manufacturing. There isn't any question of the importance of the relationship. But it's important that in Taiwan, the appreciation of explaining to the U.S. and others the determination and the willpower here to defend the freedoms that you now have. Now, the question in the United States we face is, well, how exactly do we help Taiwan? And there are people who wonder whether the United States itself has the resolve and dependability to be a secure ally. There are reasons why people question this. I want to address this issue so that we can, I think, resolve it, or at least show that we're aware that people are concerned about it. I know that some of it comes from Donald Trump and what he said during his administration, and the prospect that he might come back, which I hasten to assure you I believe is still small. But I've recounted in my book any number of times when Trump would hold up his Sharpie pen and he would point to the tip and say, see that? That's Taiwan. And then he'd point to the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, which is a huge piece of furniture, and he'd say, that's China. And that's what, in his mind, made a difference. But Donald Trump was an aberration in American political life. And it's not going to be reflected when we get, I think, to the 2024 election. There are doubts about other Western countries. I'm sure Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, didn't win himself a lot of friends on this island when he went back to France after visiting China and said that he wanted to have a global strategic partnership with China. That sounds a lot like an alliance. I'm sure you saw what the Chinese ambassador to France, who said about the lack of independence of the former republics of the Soviet Union. I don't know what it is in France, but maybe the ambassador and President Macron have a relationship and exchanged these views before. I don't think that what Macron said really reflects where Europe is. I think, but it shows the work that has to be done in order to maintain Taiwan's strength in diplomatic relations around the world. We all talk about defense spending, for example. The United States spends about 3.25% of its gross domestic product on defense. I have said, and others have said, we need to go back to the levels of Ronald Reagan's presidency, 5 to 6%, to face the threats we see around the world. NATO has a standard of 2%. Secretary General of NATO recently said it should go to 3%, which is in the right direction, although not enough. The Prime Minister of Japan recently said he wanted to double Japan's defense spending over the next 5 years to go from 1 to 2% of GDP. That's a step in the right direction. Taiwan spends about 2.4% of GDP on defense for this current budget year. That's better than the NATO standard, so that's a plus. But if the U.S. is going to 5 or 6%, others have to come up too. That's a reality. Politicians don't like to talk about this, of whatever party, but let's look at the reality we're going to have to face. I would say when it comes to U.S. resolve and dependability, that we are, of course, subject to democratic pressures, no better, no worse than any other country in that regard. But I'd also just leave you with words that Winston Churchill once said. He said, "You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing, usually after they've tried everything else." And there are times where we go through trying everything else. But just stay with us. We'll get to the right point in due course. Now, the U.S. response to help Taiwan against the Chinese threat has to be fully global. And we have not yet reached the point, I think, where we're doing this. But we need to make up for lost time. And again, it's not just on politico-military issues. We have to deal with Chinese economic misbehavior. But we also have to build up new structures of deterrence in advance of the Chinese threat becoming concrete. Because if we wait too long, it will be too late. So, for example, economically, as I mentioned before, China has been stealing intellectual property from the United States and others for decades. We've done very little about it. But one thing that would get China's attention is if we said, no goods or services made in whole or in part from stolen intellectual property can be sold in the United States. That would wake them up because so much of their economy depends on stolen property. We could broaden that. We could have Japan, South Korea, Europe say the same thing. No Chinese goods based on anybody's stolen intellectual property could be sold in those markets. You know, when I raised this proposal, some people say, but that's so harsh. That would have such a huge impact on trade. Well, yes, it would. That's the point. Because they've stolen so much, they need to feel the pain. You know, I think that we need to look at adjusting supply chains from China that affect national security. I'm not talking about a new industrial policy. I think most of it you can leave to the free market as people realize we haven't reached the end of history. Political risk still exists. But on things that involve key national security supplies that come from China, I think we need a very careful assessment of steps to take to make sure that we don't find ourselves reliant on China in time of crisis. And I think that that's something that Taiwan can be very helpful on. And I think this is another way to get conversations between governments in Southeast Asia, in particular in Taiwan, whether or not there are full diplomatic relations, to help talk about these economic issues. Now, on the politico-military side, I think there's a lot more bilaterally we need to do between the United States and Taiwan. I said in 2000, so 23 years ago, that the United States should extend full diplomatic relations to Taiwan. When Taiwan was expelled from the United Nations, George H.W. Bush, who was then the U.S. ambassador, suggested as a compromise that rather than oust Taiwan and seat the PRC, that we have what he called dual recognition, that Taiwan would keep its seat and that the PRC would take the permanent seat on the Security Council, but it would keep Taiwan in the UN and it would have allowed the U.S. to extend recognition. That was rejected by both Taiwan and the PRC at the time. That's water over the dam, but it seems to me that dual recognition still makes sense from the U.S. perspective. This would be very displeasing to Beijing. But that, again, is part of the point, because it would show that the relationship between our two countries is fixed and is not going to go away. There are a lot of things below the level of full diplomatic relations we can also do, and I hope will do as time goes by. But beyond that, we need a much deeper and richer strategic dialogue between officials of Taiwan, not just diplomats, but military officials, intelligence officials, everybody concerned with national security. The whole Taiwanese national security team needs deeper interaction with the U.S. national security team. It's not just a question of supplying this weapon system or that weapon system. We need coordination, as we have with many other allies, contingency planning, thinking through what China might do and how we respond. If you have to think it through once an attack has taken place, it's too late. And it really is something Taiwan should press for. The more of this kind of discussion that we have to consider the complex range of scenarios that we might face, the greater the prospect of successfully defending Taiwan, but even more important, the greater the prospect of deterring the Chinese aggression in the first place. I really think that if Xi Jinping did decide to make a move on Taiwan and failed, it would be regime threatening for him. And we need to do more to convince Xi Jinping that he can't prevail, because that ultimately is the way to success. We need many more freedom of navigation exercises in the Taiwan Strait. We need to make it clear that these repeated Chinese efforts to surround Taiwan, to interfere in its airspace, to interfere in its operations in international waters, all of these things that China has been doing are simply not something that we can accept. You know, the backlog in military sales to Taiwan is now estimated to be $19 billion. We need to clear that up. Part of that is a U.S. problem. Our defense industrial base is not as strong as it used to be. We need to improve that for global reasons, but particularly for Taiwan. And we need to see that other countries like the European Union also do more to stand up to these Chinese threats. The head of the European Union Foreign Policy, Josep Borrell of Spain, called on European navies also to conduct freedom of navigation operations in the Taiwan Strait, and that's a real plus. And we have to tell China and Russia what the consequences are if they take action against Taiwan, not just in the immediate response, but over the longer term, to basically excommunicate China from the international economic system if it did take military action against Taiwan or attempt to throw a blockade around it. There's much more that needs to be done, not just in the military space, not just making Taiwan a porcupine, but getting more cooperation from other countries in the region and around the world. Because as I said earlier, the more Taiwan is embedded with other countries in collective security, collective defense efforts, the lower the likelihood that China will take military action. For example, in the Indo-Pacific region right now, there's a lot of new thinking because of the concern many countries have, not just Taiwan and the threat it faces, but all along China's periphery. For example, the so-called Quad involving Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. It's not NATO by any stretch of the imagination. There isn't going to be an East Asian NATO anytime soon. But there are steps that can be taken by countries that share a common concern about Chinese belligerence to guard against it and to convince the Chinese that any action they would take would be far more costly than what they could expect. So the Quad has an interesting possible future to it. Maybe South Korea should join and become a Quint. There are a lot of different things that could be done, a lot of cooperation that other countries, including Taiwan, could have with the Quad in areas military and non-military. This is all something that people here in Taiwan should be talking more about. I'm sure you're familiar with the AUKUS project, the cooperation between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to build nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. Significant in many, many important respects. Number one, it brings the United Kingdom back into the Indo-Pacific. You know, after they gave Hong Kong back to China, their role in the Pacific region diminished significantly. This is a way to get the Brits back in, and I think that's entirely positive. It puts, in time, it will put 8 to 10 nuclear-powered attack submarines into the Indo-Pacific. The only threat they face is from China. Everybody knows what this is about. And it's a way of sharing this technology in ways that I think strengthen the possibility of peace and security by strengthening the deterrence structures. Many other countries could find ways to emulate AUKUS. I think Japan will want to have nuclear-powered submarines in due course, and I think it's time for that to happen. This is the sort of thing that at many different levels with many different kinds of self-defense structures that Taiwan could think about too. It goes very much with the idea that the more that you want to protect the island, the more activities you have to undertake internationally. Because the more China sees a broad array of countries determined not to succumb to their efforts to establish hegemony, the less the chance that they will take those kinds of actions. There are lots of ways, even without state-to-state communication through non-governmental organizations or through government intelligence channels. You know, one thing about intelligence agencies is they don't hand out daily press releases of who they meet with, and that's why governments often use their intelligence agencies for communication that might otherwise be handled through their foreign affairs ministries. That's something to think about as well. So I think that to conclude here, and I know in the next panel we'll have a lot of chance to cover other issues too, but I think it's important to understand, since we've left the post-Cold War era, that things are moving very fast internationally. The geopolitical tectonic plates around the world are shifting, and they're moving at a pace that means that for Taiwan in particular, its pace of activity needs to keep up. And this should be a top priority both in Taipei and in Washington, with as many efforts as are now expended on strengthening the partnership. We all need to do more. We're very likely facing Cold War levels of threat for the foreseeable future. I was around, and I remember when China bombarded what we then called Quemoy and Matsu. And the government here and the government in Washington stood up to those attacks. About 25 years ago, I went to Kinmen, as it's called now, and I have to tell you, I was amazed to stand on the beaches and look across and see PRC islands within swimming distance for a good swimmer. Not me today, but within swimming distance for a good swimmer. And in 1958, we stood against that and prevented the loss of Quemoy and Matsu. So people talk about how threatening it is here today. We've seen this before. China was much weaker then. It's a bigger threat now. But a lot of this depends on resolve and determination by the people who are threatened. And I think that as we face these higher risks and challenges, strengthening the alliance is critical. Let's be clear. We've seen in trying to negotiate an end to the nuclear weapons programs of North Korea and Iran, trying to stop Russia and China from engaging in proliferation, trying to push back on terrorist groups in places like Afghanistan. There's a real similarity in the way they negotiate and what they do when they reach agreements. Authoritarian states and terrorist groups are essentially incapable of negotiating in good faith unless you hold a gun to their head. And the minute you take the gun away, they renege on their commitment. So if you're going to have agreements, the adversaries who are authoritarians or terrorists, and sometimes they're both, have to know that there's a real price to pay if they break those commitments. And I don't think people in the U.S. or here in Taiwan or many other places really fully appreciate that. And I just want to close by reminding everybody what I said earlier. These were originally words of Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, but I think they hold true across the board. Strength is not provocative. Weakness is provocative. And as Ronald Reagan used to put it, the best way to preserve peace is through strength. Nobody wants war. It's not Taiwan that's flying sophisticated weapons-capable drones near Chinese territory. It's not Taiwan that's threatening the status quo. The threat's coming from the mainland, and as soon as we realize that and deal with it, Taiwan will be safer, the U.S. will be safer, and the world will be safer, and at peace. Thank you very much.
Ambassador 张保姆，我们这里展开一下，咱们用快跑到家。谢谢谢谢。咱这段时间就到这结束吼，佮刷到一个票据。咱有较早，我看卖吼。咱即摆来休困吼，咱10点半，10点半咱等下食